The Ashkenaz Festival, North America's largest celebration of Jewish music, arts, and culture, is happening at venues across Toronto from August 27th to September 2nd. Witness diverse musical expressions of the Jewish experience, from klezmer and Yiddish styles to Sephardic, Mizrahi, Falasha music, and much more. Go to ashkenaz.ca for venue and ticket information.
This is Bonjour Chai, the classically Avi edition. I'm Phoebe Maltz-Bovey, here as always with Avi Feingold. We are your frozen chosen.
On today's show, we are talking about classical education and its role in Jewish society. We're talking to two guests this week. First, we talked to Rabbi Eric Grossman, who's here to tell us about classical education in general. And then we talked to Rabbi Mark Gottlieb of the Tikva Fund about their new initiative, the Emet Classical Academy. All this and more coming right up. It is back to school. I've been noticing this phenomenon of classical education, both at the university level and at the high school level, and I've been wanting to cover it for a while. So we are going to do a show today about Jewish classical education. Phoebe, what do you know about classical education?
Well, as you're speaking, it's occurring to me that I think my younger daughter might be in a classical education daycare because they're doing the fundamentals. You know, they're learning the letters and numbers and so forth. So who knows?
As opposed to what? Like
I'm just kidding. As opposed to reading the Woke Baby board book on loop. I don't know. Yeah, so classical education seems to be a trend based on my extreme knowledge of having read two JTA articles about it prior to recording with you. It seems to be a bigger trend in education that's about returning to the basics, sort of the core curriculum idea, great books, all of this, but with a sort of 2024 specific twist now and a Jewish specific twist of rejecting so-called wokeness at a time when social justice approaches that are very popular in Jewish and mainstream education are seen by many as not super friendly to Jews. So that seems to be both the general and the specific of this in a nutshell, as best as I can tell. Avi, does that seem accurate, inaccurate?
Yeah, my initial reaction, I'm sure we'll get into it, was always that classical education seemed to be something that was taken by conservative individuals in society as saying, this is our return to our roots, and this is a way to talk about conservatism without having to talk about conservatism. I didn't have a classical education unless, maybe, I don't know, if you go to yeshiva and all you study are old Jewish texts, without having to study Plato and Aristotle, does that count as a classical education?
So I love that you ask this question because this hits on one of the big Bonjour Chai themes, which is the difference between sort of traditionalism and the kind of artificial traditionalism of moderns who are fed up with modernity. And these two can't ever be totally separated, but I think that like the difference between being a woman in a traditionalist society and being a trad wife influencer, we've talked about these different things. And I think there's a difference, as best as I can tell, between a traditional Jewish day school, like an Orthodox Jewish day school that's just teaching what it's taught for however many decades, centuries, teaching the same sorts of texts in the same sorts of ways with, some adjustments, and being an institution catering to a new Jewish classical day school seems to be doing in New York City, catering to families who would otherwise have been using public or secular private schools, but want to return with the V to tradition.
Yeah, so I can definitely see that. And it seems like the distinction that's being made here is whether it's a choice or not, whether you're saying the people that are trad wives, it's almost a return to it. It's I've seen the whole world. I've done all of this stuff. Yes. I'm returning to this world. I'm saying that this is the world that I'd like to be in. And that's where trad and conservatism comes in, whereas classical education is basically saying we welcome, in theory, all these different ideas, but the ideas that we think are the most valuable are the ones that have been around for a very long time.
When I hear about something like classical education, my priors on this would be that this is to some extent about rejecting like queer studies, BIPOC studies. It's wanting to have Shakespeare rather than Toni Morrison on a reading list, and that there's an undercurrent of something. Now, whether that something is bigotry, conservatism, traditionalism, whatever you want to call it, it's different undercurrents. But the point is that there are political undercurrents, I think, at this point. And that I think that there was a way that a great books education could function, and perhaps in some contexts does, that doesn't assume that just because something is old and by a white man, it's inherently valuable, which is, I think, sometimes what you get a little bit, where something gets kind of treated as a serious text because it's old and by a white man, and that isn't maybe quite rising to the level of a Shakespeare or a Plato or anything like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think there's a way of doing great books that is, to use a trendy term, inclusive. And there's a way of doing great books that's intentionally not. But I think what interests me about this topic at this time is just that I think there is a post-October 7th sense among a lot of otherwise secular, liberal-minded Jews that the left isn't a welcoming place and looking for something else, and that there might be a hunger for something else, and that might be what some of this is about.
I guess to me, the question, the way that you're saying it, like, how do we want to do the great books, we want to look at all these things, but we also have to be careful that we're not excluding the people that have these lenses as saying, well, we're going to reject that and the entirety of the existence of these people because we're studying one thing.
There's no reason to think that you have to have a studies type interdisciplinary lens to be inclusive of the diverse student body. It's more that is, now we're talking about something else, which is like the question of sort of student as consumer, and that is what is expected these days by a certain part of the, would-be student body. And that's what gets conflated with inclusivity. But yeah, I mean, obviously great books were not exclusively written by people who physically and politically resemble J.D. Vance.
Correct. Our plan for today is we have two actually separate interviews. We are going to interview Rabbi Eric Grossman, who's been on the show before. He's the head of school at the Akiva School, about the nature of classical education. He has a lot of ideas and thoughts, and he has some background on this. He's going to give us a bit of a backgrounder. And then we're going to talk to Rabbi Mark Gottlieb, who is the chief learning officer, I believe, for Tikva, which is one of the sponsors, I guess, of the Emet Classical Academy, which is the thing that really brought this on our radar. First up is our interview with Rabbi Eric Grossman, coming right up. With us now is Rabbi Eric Grossman. Rabbi Grossman is the head of school at the Akiva School in Montreal, as well as the co-host of the Lesson Plans podcast about educational theory. Full disclosure, I am the other co-host. Eric, welcome back to Montreal.
Thank you. It's always great to join you guys again.
So when this came on our radar, this idea of classical education, I couldn't think of anybody else to talk about because it really seems to start with educational theory and what's the nature of classical education versus regular education. And I get the sense that you might actually be a fan of classical education. Can you explain to us in broad strokes what classical education is and how it might relate to Jewish education?
I appreciate you thinking about me, and your intuitions are correct. I am a huge fan of classical education. And I want to tell you from my perspective, that obviously you ask different people, they'll give different definitions. I don't think there's one all-encompassing definition of classical education. But my understanding of it is an approach to education that relies on great books, that goes back to classical texts, and classical in the sense of texts that have been vetted by time. Texts and ideas and authors that have survived over the ages because of the belief in education that things that survive are of great and deep value, and that history sorts things out. So that right now there might be some books, there might be some ideas, there might be some authors, might be some trends that are popular. But we know, especially in the field of education, I have this week, we finished our teacher training week and school started this week. We spend a week in teacher training, and we know that the vast majority of the ideas we talk about in teacher training are fads. And we know that in a couple years, they're going to be out of fashion. There's a lot of cynicism in the educational world about this, especially among teachers. And we can rely on the fact that something like Shakespeare has survived the test of time. We can rely on the fact that someone like Plato has survived the test of time. Or in Jewish education, we can rely on the fact that the Bible and the Talmud have stood the test of time. And classical education goes back to these texts because they're not trendy. They are at the foundation of Jewish and Western civilization.
So I went to the University of Chicago undergrad myself, which has a core curriculum. So I'm familiar with this at a university or college level. Is this much of a phenomenon in school? Because I guess I always thought of it as you go to school, you go to high school, and you do this regardless, because this is just kind of it's taken for granted in high school. But how present is classical education / how under threat is classical education at the high school level currently?
I think that it has been under threat for the last generation in exactly the same way that was under threat in the university world. I think exactly the same phenomenon that you've experienced. One of the issues is that everything that I described so far sounds very conservative, right? It sounds very old white male. It sounds very, old fashioned. With the great books, you talked about the University of Chicago, of course, the classical great books education is actually at Columbia University. And that's been a source of great controversy because especially starting in the 60s, there's a question like, why are all of these great books always dead white European males? Shouldn't we be adding black authors? Shouldn't we be adding indigenous authors? Shouldn't we be adding women, et cetera, et cetera? So it sounds very, very conservative. And I think the way that many conservative ideas have come under siege in university education as the universities have moved to the left, I think it's happened in the schools as well as the schools have moved to the left. Which brings me to my second point, which I didn't get to make earlier, but this is a perfect time. This doesn't necessarily have to be something conservative. Classical education contains many, many liberal ideas and can be taught in a very, very liberal way. The very first Jewish high school that I worked for, my very first job out of college, it was the New Jewish High School of Greater Boston, which was founded on very, very liberal educational principles. All teaching was supposed to be non-frontal. We didn't have grades. We were supposed to constantly be in discussion with students. We were never supposed to say that something was right or wrong. Very, very, very liberal. And at the same time, our faculty meetings, no one believed me, but I'm telling you this is the truth. Our faculty meetings were the entire staff sitting around a table and reading through and discussing Platonic dialogues. Okay. Completely based on very, very classical texts, yet in a very, very liberal setting. So I think part of the issue is we tend to conflate classical education with conservative, and this particular school that's on our minds now, of course, is being founded by a conservative think tank. And I think that's something that we need to disambiguate. There is a Venn diagram here, but it's not so easy to say that it's one or the other. I know I veered a little off topic, but
no, it's actually very on topic because it seems like the idea of classical education really has been, I wouldn't say co-opted, maybe I should, but it's been taken up by conservative thinkers. And the places where you see it championed, both in secondary, primary education, but also in the university world, is by conservative thinkers who say we need a return to these classical values, which is really often coded for we need to be able to say certain things in society without being able to say them out loud. And this is classical education is one of those ways. So how I can see what and I agree with what you're saying, that it can be very liberal. How do we reclaim that? How do we go and maintain that balance? Or how do we examine classical education in light of the fact that mostly nowadays it's conservative thinkers that are using it?
I think the Jewish world has a tremendous amount to contribute here, because one of the fascinating trends in liberal Jewish circles in the last decade especially has been the delving and the exploration of classical Jewish texts by very liberal and even quite left-wing Jewish institutions. These secular yeshivot that are opening in Israel, institutions like the Pardes Institute, and even far left websites like Jew School, quite on the left, even to the hard left, but say our legitimacy comes from our mastery of classical sources, and also pointing out that classical sources contain very liberal ideas. Plato, who is, of course, at the heart of all of this, Plato is also at the heart of left-wing ideas. In fact, communism more naturally flows out of Plato than it does out of his student Aristotle, and such, who's, of course, also classical text. But my point is, classical education does not necessarily have to be conservative, and certainly, interestingly, in the Jewish circles, it's not necessarily associated with that.
So just to keep on this topic of politics, I agree that in principle, classical education doesn't have to be conservative. The way I experienced, again, at the University of Chicago was basically, here are these core texts, but it's sort of freeing that it's showing anybody can interpret them. You don't have to be physically resembling Socrates to be involved in any of this. Fine, that much makes sense. But what I have seen, another shift, so another part of my background is that I am a non-academic researcher of culture wars things, and classical has come to mean something very specific, especially in the online right wing. And I'm thinking of something like sort of memes and so forth, return to tradition with the return with the V instead of the U, that kind of thing. Reject modernity, embrace tradition, trad wives, all of this. It sounds like silly pop culture, but this is the mainstream right wing now. And I feel like a lot of the impetus to embrace something called classical these days is about not so much a pure love of Shakespeare outside of trendiness and so forth, but about a very, very culturally specific desire to reject DEI or awareness weeks of that, and things like that. So I guess what I'm wondering is, is this just conservative now?
I think you're correct that that's probably where we're going. But again, I'm going to make that distinction from the Jewish and the non-Jewish world. And that's why this high school is so interesting, because of this intersection between, where its funding is coming from and where the leanings are of its leadership. But it doesn't have to be. I'll say that this is also parallel to the debate on the right, between classical liberal and conservative. Right? Because classical liberal is liberal, right? Is the idea of opening up the mind. There's nobody who is more in favor of opening up the mind than Socrates, as you mentioned, right? That's his whole rage against the man. I mean, you can't get more than Socrates, who undermines all of, his own society. So certainly it doesn't have to be that. And I guess the question is, is the left going to allow the right to usurp these texts and to usurp the idea of classical education? I don't know the answer to that.
Well, what would the warning signs be? Where would you start saying, look, I really respect the idea of a classical education, but this school is going about it all wrong because they're stifling X, or they're only teaching a certain point of it, or they're teaching it in a way that actually distorts the idea of great books or whatever the ideas that are being put out of it.
No, I think that the question is going to be, and I fault both sides on this. I am from the traditional world of education. And the traditional world of education says that the classroom needs to be a place of open ideas. So the question is going to be, are these classrooms going to be places where the text can speak for themselves and allow students to interpret, as Phoebe says, however they wish? Or are these going to be platforms for people producing their own views? And I don't know what's going to happen. And certainly the trend in all of education, much to my chagrin as an educator, certainly over the last decade, has been using classrooms as places for teachers to promulgate their own views of these texts. That's going to be the question. And whether we have open classrooms or not. And I fault the left and the right equally on this. I've seen this done terribly in both directions.
Before we let you go, how do you, as the head of school at the Akiva School, use classical education as an example within your school? I know it's only a kindergarten through 6 education, but you must be preparing students in a classical way. If you believe so much in this, give me some examples of what you do with your teachers and with the students to do classical education.
First of all, in the Jewish school, it's very easy because classical texts are at the center of Jewish education: Bible, Talmud, Mishnah. So implicit in any Jewish education is respect for ancient texts. I will say, before I was in elementary education, I was in secondary education. And I think my favorite class, and perhaps my students' favorite class, I taught an elective in Plato's Republic. I was a Bible teacher, I was a Jewish studies teacher, but I always taught an elective in Plato's Republic. And what I loved about that was making that transition and showing that it's not only Jewish texts, but the Western world also has its own classical texts, which can be interpreted the same way. To me, it's all about a respect for the great works of the past, and believing that there is great wisdom to be found in the past, and to allowing books to speak for themselves, and not us bringing our ideas to text, but allowing text to speak to
Eric,
us.
it's been great having you on. Thank you so much for this background. Please come back anytime, and good luck on the school year.
Thank you so much, and it's always a pleasure being with you.
Thank you.
So the impetus for this show today was the announcement earlier this year of the launch of the Emet Classical Academy, which was a project of the Tikva Fund. Rabbi Mark Gottlieb is the Chief Education Officer of Tikva and the founding dean of the Tikva Scholars Program. And before that, he was the head of school at Yeshiva University High School for boys and the principal of the Maimonides School in Brookline, where 20 years ago this fall, I was a teaching fellow at the Rabbi Joseph E. Soloveitchik Institute at the Maimonides School. So he was my head of school as well as a teaching fellow, and it was a wonderful experience. I'm really glad to reconnect with Rabbi Gottlieb. Welcome to Montreal.
Thanks so much, Avi. It's great to see you again. It's been a long time, but very happy to meet you in this new venue.
Thank you. So what is the Emet Classical Academy, and what was the impetus for starting it?
So the Emet Classical Academy is, to our knowledge, the first classical school under a Jewish auspices that's really meant to promote a old new vision of Jewish education. When I say old new, in the sense that we believe that classical education has a firm founding or a long pedigree in Jewish education. In the 19th century, you might think of places like Rav Hirsch's Frankfurt. You might think of the kind of education that someone like Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik in the 20th century received. But of course, it dates back to figures like the Rambam and Rabbi Bachya. The idea that God created two books, the book of the Torah and the book of the world, or the book of nature, and that each is a commentary upon one another. So this idea of studying the world in its fullness, studying human culture and civilizations in their fullness, is something that is a part of a proper Jewish education. New, I say, in the sense that whether it was the Holocaust or change in ideological orientations of modern Jewry in the 20th century, this kind of integrated, holistic education has not received the prominence that it once enjoyed. And so Emet is meant to really return to that tradition of studying the world, studying human civilizations and cultures with a Jewish lens, or through a Jewish lens. And it's a school that's opening to nearly 40 students in grades 5, 6, and 9. We hope to double or triple that in the next 3 years or so. But it's something that we're excited about at Tikva. We've received some wonderful responses, both in the general classical world, both Christian and charter classical worlds, and in the Jewish educational world. So it's an exciting, I want to say it's more than an experiment, but it is an exciting opportunity to renew a tradition in Jewish education that we think can give powerful impetus to a renaissance in Jewish education today.
What I'm curious about is, what is different about Emet that doesn't exist already in Jewish day schools that are teaching a lot of these classical texts already? If we think about Jewish day schools that are perfectly primed for the most part to be thinking about classical education as places where Tanakh and Talmud are taught regularly, what makes Emet so different, and what is it filling in a void that, for example, in New York, that Ramaz isn't filling, or the other great day schools in New Jersey that are just over the border and that send a lot of kids to it. And in Canada, we have great Jewish day schools that have what might otherwise seem, based on what you just said, as similar education, an educational theory.
Sure. I like to say that it's the best of times and the worst of times for Jewish education. I mean, there's no doubt that Jewish education in the past couple of decades could rightfully be seen as a golden age of Jewish education. In Bergen County, where I live, there are about 20 day schools alone, and we're probably serving more Jewish students in Jewish day schools than ever before in North American history. So that's something to celebrate, and that's certainly worthy of our collective praise. But at the same time, I would say that in many Jewish day schools, and I wouldn't say this is the case in every Jewish day school, some of the schools that you've mentioned, Avi, are doing a fine job and are continue to be great examples and exemplars of Jewish education. But I would say in many schools, there is no thread that unites all of the disciplines. In other words, each subject matter tends to be siloed from the other. So you have, one period you're learning Chumash, and in the next period you're learning history or social studies, and you're learning science. There's not a chut hamishulash. There's not a binding thread that creates a more integrated student or a more integrated Jewish personality. These studies and disciplines are studied from their own canons and their own methods of interpretation, and to a certain extent that's appropriate, of course. But what's often missing is a unifying structure, a unifying framework that allows students to see that every discipline, from the arts to the sciences and the humanities, can be, and I would argue from a Jewish theological or Jewish worldview perspective, should be seen as a unified way to understand our place in this world as God's creatures, as children of Israel, B'ni B'chari Yisrael, as God's firstborn child, in relating to the humanities and relating to the different civilizations, starting with the ancient world, something that we pay particular attention to, both in terms of seeing where Judaism differed. In other words, where Judaism made a contribution culturally or civilizationally that really changed the course of world history, or where, in some surprising ways, where Judaism has contributed and has been at the core, not just a handmaiden to Western civilization, but at the core, the central sort of defining spirit of Western civilization. So in that sense, I think our Jewish day schools, being so focused on often getting into college, the sense of the utilitarian enterprise of modern education, where it is to get to the next level, to the next stage of education, something is lost in terms of the formation of students' minds and souls, especially with this binding or unifying perspective of Jewish thought engaged with the humanities, engaged with the sciences. So in that sense, I think Emet is trying to do something somewhat unique. Our emphasis on languages, on starting our partner school in Austin, Texas, is a Hebrew immersion program. So from the ages of 3 to 8, the students are getting 5 hours of Hebrew immersion. So focus on languages, both Hebrew language and classical Latin and Greek. Those are some differences, but I think the main difference is what I've described as this holistic worldview, this Jewish worldview that is meant to engage and have conversation meaningfully with the West.
Is the context for Emet more Jewish day schools, or sort of the broader educational system in New York? Because from what I've read, it sounds like the students are not coming primarily from the pool of students who would otherwise be at a Jewish day school, but more from public or secular private schools. Is that accurate?
Absolutely, Phoebe. The vast majority, between 60 and 70% of our families at Emmett are not coming from the Jewish day school world. They're coming from the world of private independent schools or exam public schools, the schools that you may be familiar with, Phoebe, from your Upper East Side background, that our students, the vast majority, are coming from. And the origin of that, or the genesis of that, is quite fascinating. That
was going to be my next question. It was going to be, what's the impetus for students from places like that?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really twofold. The first is just genuine academic concern that some of the schools are losing some of their standards in academics. So, for example, we heard from one parent, and it's shocking almost, that they're not learning grammar anymore in their middle schools because grammar is considered racist.
So this is here's where I'm going to have to jump in, and I should say, just by way of introduction of myself, I've written a book about what would come to be called wokeness in 2017. So I'm very familiar with these topics. Yes. And I should just say, though, like, I'm wondering how much is a kind of particularly post-October 7th sense among New York Jews, it certainly exists in Canada as well, that sort of social justice ideals and a kind of social justice trappings of education that might have been seen as kind of a piece with elite education in previous years, and just kind of either Jewish families would actively embrace it or just be kind of nodding along with it, seems not tenable anymore now. Is that what's going on? That
very much correlates, Phoebe, to what we've seen, at least in the Emmett first class of the inaugural class. I mean, many of you remember that letter from the Brearley parent that was really a kind of a confessional of what's going on in these schools and how extreme some of the independent schools have become in terms of their DEI education.
So can I explain a little bit for Canadian audiences just because I went to Spence from K through 8. I went to Stuyvesant for high school.
Okay.
So that's my educational background there.
You're in the thick of things, Phoebe. That's where
I was, although in 1800. I mean, this was not last week, right? But the point is, I don't remember a tremendous social justice component to Spence, I should say, to go. These are upscale private schools, often single sex, much more so than would be the case in Toronto. They're secular. They are, I guess, probably nominally were once Christian, but nowadays completely non-religious. They have many Jewish students. They're not majority Jewish by any means. This is where posh families, not exclusively posh families, but this is where posh families in New York City send their kids to school, not to public school, to the schools like that, and not generally to religious schools either. So what I'm interested in the sort of big picture aspect of this is there, given all that's happened at Columbia, and at private schools for younger ages, to what extent is there a kind of self-segregation happening, a disillusionment happening? That's what interests me about this topic.
Yeah, no, clearly, I mean, it's more than anecdotally. I mean, we're seeing parents that are confiding in us and saying, this is why we're leaving. We don't feel, as Jews, we no longer feel comfortable in the culture. We no longer feel like our needs, both intellectually and academically, educationally, but also more broadly from the point of view of Jewish identity and Jewish peoplehood, they don't feel, I mean, if I say safe, that maybe conveys the wrong, that they're generally not in physical danger, but they just don't feel like their interests are being met by the administration or the boards of these schools like Spence or, Brearley or Collegiate.
Although, just to jump in, it's not that these schools are suddenly without Jewish students. I want to be clear.
No, they still have, yes, and they'll still be. I met with a group of parents, Dalton parents, in fact, Jewish, small group, and they're not threatening. This group that I was meeting with wasn't threatening on leaving. They were looking to just try to create more of a balance, shift the balance away from what they were feeling as predominantly against their interests. So you're right, Phoebe. There are many Jewish parents that remain in these schools, but at Emet we've seen a migration, and many of them were basically saying, "Please create this school." And in fact, to be very candid, we originally had a longer lead time plan in terms of launching this effort. It was going to, by our designs, it was going to take 2 years or 3 years to really properly launch this. But we were just overwhelmed by these parents that were turning to us almost desperately and saying, "Please, we need this now."
What would be it may seem a little premature to speak about feeder schools, but what colleges, what universities do you imagine Emet students going on to attend?
I'm sure, a number of them will attend the kinds of selective schools that many of their peers in the Jewish day schools currently would. But, there are other options. And, Tikva is currently seeding a new venture at the University of Florida. University of Florida is one of the most selective public universities in the country. Their average SAT score is something like 1380, their average SAT score. And now they have their Hamilton Center, which is their honors program. And Tikva is looking to seed a kind of residential life along with enhanced Jewish studies offerings at Florida, at Hamilton. So we're hoping that there'll be more options. We don't believe that students and families will totally boycott these premier schools, even places like Brown and Columbia, but we want to just create more options, different possibilities, so that students can go and not have to worry about encampments and protests and feeling that they're really not a part of the community in any meaningful way, in any integrated way, in any healthy way.
So one of the things that I've been thinking about through this conversation is that, and often, whether it's true or not, whether it's right or not, this idea of classical education has been a product often in the past several years of the right. Classical education isn't necessarily conservative or progressive or liberal. It's both, but I don't always think that the antidote to a extreme liberal education is to then go and have an extreme conservative education. How do you make sure to maintain that balance so that it's not just, well, you go to Emet if you want to be, deliberately anti-DEI or anti-woke or anti-whatever, to make sure that what's being sent out there is genuinely about open inquiry and, a spirit of real learning?
Sure. That's a great question. And I think at Tikva, we definitely take that question very seriously. I'll just give you some examples of we don't believe classical education is a partisan matter. That's the first and most important thing to say. Classical education is the legacy, it's the heritage of all of humanity, all of mankind, West and East, frankly, because many times what we study in Western civilization is the product of great minds of the East. The Islamic, golden age of philosophy in the Middle Ages is just as much West as it is East. So I think classical education is the heritage of all of humanity. It should not be reduced to a partisan political matter or a partisan political association. What we do to ensure that it doesn't reduce itself to partisan politics is that we actually study the most important works that come from the left. And not just as a straw man argument. We believe that when you foster debate and inquiry and Socratic discussions, you need to find the best versions of your rivals and the best versions of the other point of view, the other school of thought. So at Tikva, we traditionally study Marx and Engels in our economics and the human good seminars. We study Rashid Khalidi and the 100-Year War on Palestine in our Zionism classes, in our classes on how to argue Zionism and how to understand Zionism, because I don't believe that an education that siphons off the alternatives is a true education. we still have a point of view. Every teacher, whether they'll acknowledge that, has a point of view, but there's a difference between education and indoctrination, and Tikva maintains, I think, very high standards when it comes to that distinction, and tries to ensure that these students are really exposed to all the ideas that are relevant to a theme, to a topic, to a question, and sees these arguments through.
One of the things that I'm worried about, I can think of an unimaginable number of Jewish day schools where in their long history there has yet to be an out gay student. That has not happened even in the last 5-10 years.
Is that actually true, Avi?
I think there are many, many, many schools. My kids go to the Ida Crown Jewish Academy. I don't think there's been an out gay student. My kids used to go to the Hebrew Academy in Montreal. I don't think there was ever an out gay student as a student in the school.
There are certainly schools in the Northeast where that's not the case.
Sure, but there are many, many where that is absolutely really the case. Now, what happens when you take a bunch of students, of parents who basically pull their kids out of school because they don't want that DEI nonsense to be taught to my kid, even if you have all the greatest intentions about a liberal education, about a classical education, how do you make sure that the environment is genuinely open and welcoming to various people? You may not like, what's being taught, but at the end of the day, people are still part of a society, and the message that they're getting might be skewed and might be different from what the teachers might actually intend.
Look, I think we trust parents and students, to be discerning. I don't like the word consumers when it comes to education. I actually find that identity deeply troubling. I think that's part of the problem in education today, that parents and students see themselves as consumers and not as parts of a legacy of education and a community of tradition. But be that as it may, I think adults and students increasingly are very savvy, are very aware of environments, and know the kinds of places that they would be welcome at, they would feel at home at, that they would not have to hide their identities. There are lots of choices now, Avi, in the landscape. Part of what we're trying to do at Emmett is to create another model where parents who are concerned about, their students' well-being educationally, can have a space that's more congenial, more supportive of who they are. And I think that that's true for families and students across the board, whatever their, educational, ideological, cultural, identities are. So I'm not worried that the creation of an Emmett Classical Academy is going to somehow, foster people to be closeted when, that's not what they want.
I don't know. I think you might be getting a few categories. Like this I think the things that are an issue in actually traditionalist religious schools may be less of one in the environment you were talking about. That it may
I
just
hope
be
so.
a different.
Yeah.
I think it just is. But yeah.
It has been at Tikva, historically, Avi. Like I just said, we and that's because this program draws on, like the Tikva Scholars Program. Emmett is not drawing from an Orthodox Jewish population in the main, and so it's a broader array of cultures and experiences.
I think what's super interesting here is just what this points to, and interesting, concerning also to me a little bit in terms of the segregation angle. We've talked about this in the past on the show in terms of the literary world and the sort of self-segregation post October 7th, where on the one hand, I'm happy to see Jewish flourishing, and like where I live in Toronto, it's uniformly Free Palestine signs. That's just how it is where I live. And I can understand the impulse to find, a safer feeling or environment. But also I think there is an importance in, keeping integration going too, and not cutting
and being aware of the
intellectual,
arguments or the intellectual points of view from the rival side in a thoughtful, intelligent, civil way. I mean, that's very vital to the kind of discourse that Tikva has always promoted.
All right. Well, good luck. We really hope to hear more about it in the future, and all the best. And please, come back anytime to report back.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure talking to you again, Avi, and really nice meeting you, Phoebe.
Thank you so much for coming on, Rabbi.
Coming up, our nachas right after we hear from our sponsors.
Y'all remember that joke from Airplane? The old lady asked for some light reading.
How about this leaflet, famous Jewish sports legends?
But in actuality, that's changing. Jews are crushing it in sports around the world, and we are here to celebrate them.
Sandy Koufax gets his 10th strikeout.
Zach Hyman, his first career hat trick. 41 points for Diddy Avdia. It's Sue Bird's building.
I'm Gabe.
And I'm Jamie.
We love Jews and we love sports, but most of all, we love kvelling over Jews in sports.
Together we host Menschwarmers, the longest-running Jewish sports podcast in the world. Listen and subscribe at thecjn.ca and wherever you find your podcasts.
Okay, Phoebe, we got nachas, we got bregas. What do you have for us this week?
I've got nachas, and it's extremely basic back-to-school nachas. I'm going to nachas the heck out of machine washable sneakers. I'm not sure if you are aware of this phenomenon. I'm not sure if I've brought it up every week. It's all a blur.
I have never heard of this.
Okay. So if you have young children whose shoes get disgusting on a daily basis and you don't know what to do about it and you don't want to have to buy them new shoes, every week, think of all the things that can happen to a child's sneakers at that age and imagine washing that all off. So I'm gonna not return to tradition in this regard. You may be nostalgic for the canvas, no nonsense shoes of your youth, but anything that can go in the laundry and come out kind of okay, I'm all for it.
Yeah, my kids are older and they know that Dad has a sneaker collection. So
do you put yours in the laundry?
I have never put a pair of sneakers in the laundry. I probably never will.
What have you got, Avi?
I guess I have something which is both a nachas and a bregas. It's in the same thing. The nachas is the reporting, the excellent reporting that our colleagues have done this week, Ellen Bessner and Jonathan Rothman, on JNF and the debacle around the removal of their ability to give tax receipts, their charitable status. There's a series of great articles. There's a series of great podcasts. You should absolutely go check it out because it is great in-depth reporting about a story that is relevant to Jewish Canadians. The bregas I have is about the same thing, and the fallout that they've been getting. Like I've been seeing so many complaints from within the Jewish community about people saying you shouldn't be doing this. This is in the family. We shouldn't be complaining about these things, especially during a war. This is very difficult. And the bregas that I have is that these individuals just fail to understand the very nature of reporting and the very nature of journalism. And it's not muckraking for the sake of muckraking, right? When you call out JNF for doing things that they shouldn't have been doing, it's because you never want those things to show up in the first place. You ideally want a society where people know that if I do something wrong, it might get reported and I'm going to have egg on my face and it's going to be shameful and it's going to be bad. If you don't want your bad thing to be in the paper, don't do the bad thing, as a colleague of ours says repeatedly. And so to all the people that are complaining about the fact that we are reporting about the JNF, just try to work with organizations that don't have bad things happen to them in the first place.
Hear, hear. I am as enthusiastic about that. In fact, even more enthusiastic about that than the machine washable sneakers.
Okay.
So yes to all of what Avi said. Bregas and nachas alike.
Before we go, we wanted to encourage you to listen to another podcast in the Jewish podcast ecosystem. Our friends at Judaism Unbound want to tell you more about Judaism and how it's being reinvented in the 21st century. They really do believe that the most ancient Jewish tradition is to reinvent Jewish tradition. Lex Rofberg, who has been on the show before, and Dan Liebenson, another good friend of mine, they enter into conversations every week with artists, rabbis, scholars, authors, and more. They do this every week. They generate ideas for present and future of Judaism, and in partnership with their listeners all around the world, they do great work. Judaism Unbound is available wherever your podcasts are found. And just a quick note to remind you that our Sermon Slam is still happening. The third annual Great Canadian Sermon Slam will be coming up before the high holidays this year. If you are a rabbi and are hearing this and want to submit a sermon, if you are a congregant and want to submit your rabbi, you want to nominate your rabbi, please email us at bonjour@thecjn.ca to be featured in our Great Canadian Sermon Slam. We'd love to have you part of it. Thank you for listening to Bonjour Chai for the week ending August 31st, Shabbat Parashat Re'eh. The show is produced by Michael Fraiman and edited by Zach Kauffman. The executive producer for CJN Podcast is Michael Fraiman. Our music is by So-Called. We are a project of the Jewish Living Lab and are distributed by the CJN Podcast Network. You can listen to all our past episodes on our page at thecjn.ca/bonjour, and you can subscribe to the podcast and automatically receive all episodes on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. We would love it if you told a friend about Bonjour Chai. It is one of the best ways we get new listeners. And as always, you can email us with comments at bonjour@thecjn.ca.
The Ashkenaz Festival, North America's largest celebration of Jewish music, arts, and culture, is happening at venues across Toronto from August 27th to September 2nd. Witness diverse musical expressions of the Jewish experience, from klezmer and Yiddish styles to Sephardic, Mizrahi, Falasha music, and much more. Go to ashkenaz.ca for venue and ticket information.